Hey, what's going on, people? So, as we know, the latest God of War has grabbed some serious media attention, with many calling it a new form of storytelling, the peak of AAA gaming, magnificent, and even some calling it the best game of the generation. As you can see, I've played the previous God of War games when they came out. Don't own the original PS2 version anymore, quite sadly. I must have traded in at some point, but overall, I've for the most part enjoyed the series, or perhaps more accurately, I've enjoyed its take on Greek mythology, something I'm very fond of, and the same applies to Norse mythology. So I know my lore to those mythologies. I can assure you there will be no major spoilers in this review, just me talking about the gameplay mostly. So let's get started. The previous God of War games all had very memorable opening sections full of colossal boss fights that were a spectacle to behold, and many times left your jaw on the floor. In God of War 1, the original, you had the Hydra on the ship, which at the time was very pretty immense, and I think still looks great to this day. In the sequel, you had the battle against the Colossus of Rhodes, which was an epic battle through the city of Rhodes itself, throwing many obstacles at the player, which kept the momentum going. And finally, in God of War 3, the last mainland God of War I played, because I skipped God of War Ascension, you had yourself squaring off against Poseidon whilst battling on the back of the Titan Gaia, which I'll argue is one of the best opening sequences in video games, and still looks stunning. Now, come to the new God of War, and as you can see, this is a drastically different take on what had come before. In many ways, it also sets the pace. This intro also sets the pace for a large chunk of the game, I feel. Kratos is older, much slower, less athletic, but still retains much of his former strength. This is something I struggled with throughout most of the game, and it's the same thing I also struggled with whilst playing as the new Lara Croft. These once athletic characters, brought more down to earth. And it'll be up to each gamer to decide if they prefer that change in gameplay or not. But as for me, it caused me a number of gripes, which affected the gameplay, and I feel designing the world as well. But before I start talking about my criticisms with the game, let's start with the positives. This game is indeed a stunning looking title. The world looks and feels organic for the most part, and you get a much greater sense of cohesive, believable environments than I got in, say, Rise of the Tomb Raider. Everything looks rich in detail, which really adds to the atmosphere of the world. Gone are the somewhat pristine Greek-like architectures, and in their place is a rugged, ancient feeling, forgotten realm where nature reigns supreme. Then, for me, there is the World Serpent, who was not only the best character in the game, I feel, but also one of the best looking and also best sounding creatures I've heard in a video game. I don't class the World Serpent as a spoiler, as he's been in every trailer pretty much, but I highly recommend that you once you start playing this game, that you crank up the volume and bass on your sound setup, ready for when this thing opens its mouth, as I found it to be utterly incredible.
I am!
What does it say?
So the World Serpent I thought was awesome. Then we have Kratos as a character. I actually found this Kratos to be more similar to his original character in the first God of War, before they turned him into the over-angry, constantly shouting mess that he became in God of War 2 and 3, and afterwards until this reboot. This Kratos is haunted by his past, and I found more delight in seeing him dealing with this, his backstory, than the story arc with his son, which I have to say, from my perspective, was nowhere near as emotional or gripping as many made out. But it certainly still had some good moments. But even from me myself as a father, I just couldn't take it as seriously or get as emotionally involved as some people have for whatever reasons. I discussed this not long ago on the Juices Loose podcast, where we've experienced emotional story arcs, concerning troubled fathers, parents, and their children, and other family dramas, etc. in other games. And one game that instantly came to mind, when we were talking about it, is another heralded PlayStation title, which was Final Fantasy VII, and the short but very powerful story arc between Barrett, Dini or Dine, whichever however you call him, and their young daughter Marlene. There are many times where a single cutscene, sometimes coupled with the right music and text, have just as much impact, if not more, than something that is pushing high-end graphics where the characters' faces can show many forms of emotion. The game Journey, as an example, being another PlayStation title that for me left my jaw on the floor, gave me goosebumps, and even made me contemplate family and death. It was a very emotional game with no text, no dialogue or anything. So emotional stories can be delivered in many different ways, and I've certainly experienced much better ones than I have in this recent God of War. The story arc of Kratos and his son was okay from my perspective, but they took a backseat to Kratos himself and his more personal past for me. Something that I feel if you had played the previous God of Wars would certainly have pulled on more nostalgia strings than anything else. And I actually think that is a great achievement for them, being able to age Kratos and make his past seem so historic, even though the God of War as a series doesn't feel necessarily owed to me. It makes me wish they'd done the same thing with the new Lara Croft instead of making her younger. We could certainly do with more older, confident and powerful female characters in games today. As for plus points, really big plus points, that's about it for me. Don't take that as a negative. Everything else falls into the realms of simply good, okay, and sometimes disappointing. The combat in the game for me feels watered down compared to previous games. Not watered down. That's the wrong way to say it. But even then, the combat in the previous God of Wars wasn't always amazing. And games like Bayonetta quickly put them to shame. They've removed a lot of stuff from Kratos in terms of combat. I miss being able to freeze characters with Medusa's head, even though you can freeze the odd character with your axe in this game. Medusa's head was a good overall effect. I miss being able to create area effect spells, like the lightning attack and his Spartan shields. I miss being able to flick between multiple weapons that are acquired after defeating bosses, epic bosses, because many of these weapons changed up the playstyle of combat enough for you not to get too tired with the standard weapon. Something after a while I felt grate on me a little bit with the Leviathan axe. It initially starts off to have a great feel, and it doesn't really disappear. But as combat progressed, it was evident that the combat wasn't going to evolve much further, which was a shame. As this was a next gen God of War, I would have liked to have seen the combat evolve a bit further than just what this game offers, which in a sense is still a hack and slash in that respect. Kratos himself in many cutscenes is able to smash down trees, launch giant boulders with ease, punch through solid stone. Yet none of this exists in the combat itself for the player to really have a sense of strategy and environment interaction when tackling enemies. You kind of end up just doing the same thing over and over. As even the enemies themselves don't evolve in any new or real tangible way to keep you on your toes. It kind of feels every troll, no matter what element it takes on, fire, ice or whatever, is killed in exactly the same way, which with exactly the same finishing move for the most part, and the same applies for pretty much every other creature. I'm not sure if the developers wanted to hold some creature designs back for the inevitable sequels, but compared to previous God of Wars that would throw new enemy after new enemy type at you from Greek mythology, the select amount of creatures they chose to use from Norse mythology was strikingly small, which is why I felt I was never really challenged gameplay wise in combat. As for exploration, many people compared the game to Metroid in terms of how you go back through previous areas to unlock things. I initially disagreed with this, but had not gotten through the game enough to fully confirm it. I can now safely say that there are indeed some elements of backtracking, but unlike with Metroid games, the new skills obtained to reach once unreachable areas essentially do not change up the gameplay at all for Kratos himself. He doesn't get any new abilities that offer greater movement or gameplay variation to move around the previous environments in different ways. The only resemblance I can see that is that by passing back through previous areas, you might obtain the odd disposable item, whether that's a new rune, some new armor or material to make new armor and weapons, all of which don't, for the most part, change up gameplay. Although, as your skill tree grows, you're given new flashier combat moves that essentially just make you even more invincible, in combat. And once again, enemies don't change up in any way to really challenge these new movesets that you get. As tacked on as the RPG elements felt in this game, it's somewhat nice to continue upgrading your weapons and items, and it does indeed work for the most part. And I didn't mind the upgraded system. Where exploration is plagued the most for me is with how incredibly linear the game is. Now, linear games can be fine, of course, but God of War suffers, I feel, from tutorial syndrome, where everything is pretty much spelled out for you. You know exactly where to go, what you can interact with or can't interact with everything. Because everything is pretty much glowing yellow. In terms of exploration, you can't help but feel guided, and any wrong paths are so short. There's no sense of getting lost or sense of true exploration. Ledges are highlighted in yellow, like in Tomb Raider, where they're all highlighted in white. Because the developers don't want you to go anywhere else. They're just set paths, basically. There are those moments then where I miss being able to jump. Although Kratos seems completely capable. In this game, as he has these moments where he can leap at ledges with a button press and pulls himself up with one arm. He's that strong. Or moments like this, where it looks like you can hop over a knee-high ledge into an somewhat inviting area, but the game refuses to let this happen. Something I learned very early on. Even moments like where Kratos as a character would be fully capable of simply leaping over into this new area, but you're not allowed because they want you to go down a certain path. It's something that bugs me in many ways, where you have a character with particular skills, yet they are denied using them in fear that it would either break the game or force the designers to think outside of the linear box to create something more engaging for the player. I'm the God of War. I can climb up a small rock face without a rope, or step over a small wall for Crom's sake. It's one of those scripted games where there's no true platforming or exploration given to the player. Only illusions of control that the developer wants to give to you. You notice this in a lot of Sony first-party games, or just these type of AAA games of this nature, really, where there are essentially no fail states for the player, only direction. Pathways are all linear, so there is no sense of danger when making climbs or leaps. Essentially nothing is an obstacle, so you're just going through the motions. A gap between cutscenes designed to not essentially challenge the player in any meaningful way. And because of this, your control of Kratos feels like nothing more than an illusion at times, that there is no real engagement between the controller and the character. Some will say that this game is not meant to be a platformer, but the previous games were in many aspects had those moments, right? So you have to ask yourself if removing these features instead of enhancing them and refining them was the better choice. Was giving the player less control better? I'm not sure. You also have the main hub area, which is a large lake that essentially connects all areas that you can go to. I found the lake itself to be pretty dull, to be fair, and nothing more than a means from getting from A to B. Although it is broken up by the many conversations that take place during these moments on your boat, some of which can be interesting to listen to for sure. I found getting distracted by some side quests around this area broke the flow of the narrative of the game, and maybe just wanted to push on with the main story. As for puzzles, I consider them to be virtually non-existent, mostly because they are too easy. And as I mentioned, everything is lit up. I mean, this is an 18 rated game, and as an it's meant to be an adult game. In more, I would like to feel in more than just goriness or storyline. I'd like to be mentally challenged with the gameplay as well. But unfortunately, it's just not there. I mean, at the start of the game, you'll use Atreus, your son, for example, to crawl through tunnels in order for him to drop down a chain for you to climb up. And these types of simple AI character uses persist throughout the entire game, never really evolving. The same issue I had with The Last of Us and Ellie and Joel's interactions for puzzles. Sometimes you're just standing there and thinking, for Crom's sake, just jump up there, Kratos. It's really not that high, or actually give me something to think about. Gauge me as a player gameplay wise. Otherwise, you can borderline on becoming essentially a walking simulator, which this game is not. But that's sometimes how these developers can make these games feel when they restrict interaction. Speaking of the story, I don't want to go into any specifics here for me. It certainly kept me engaged for the most part, but there were also times, especially towards the end, where I felt that it needlessly dragged on for a while, doing the ode, you've reached your goal, but something happens which knocks you back down to the start, and you have to find another way up. I was also very disappointed by the boss battles in this God of War. I mean, God of War is about boss battles, with one fight against one giant creature. That was probably the most diverse and memorable fight in the game, and the others are, simply, they're good, but not as good as previous God of War games. Still having dramatic set pieces, but the main battles themselves that you're engaged with, being, once again, relatively easy, and sometimes, embarrassingly linear once again, but I think for the most part, the dramatic nature of the cutscenes will see most of them through. People, compare, this game also to Dark Souls, but I'm sorry, the sense of danger and fear and skill required in the boss battles in those games puts this God of War to shame. I see no comparison other than being able to roll and dodge attacks. Learning boss battles in God of War takes mere moments in this game. There's even one moment where the game, there's actually more, but this one moment locks you out of control of Kratos, and then asks you to do things like hold L1 to block, then push your left analog stick left to dodge, then press R1 or R2 to punch, and basically rinse and repeat in this particular moment, which could have been absolutely epic given this scene if you were actually controlling Kratos. Something that is done effortlessly in games like Bayonetta 2, which boss-wise, once again, and action-wise, in my opinion, puts God of War to shame. Compared to previous God of Wars, also, the amount of boss fights are embarrassingly few, as well, and it pains me to think that many were most likely cut out, because we all know how Sony like to make their games continuations of stories instead of singular experiences. God of War has lots of little details. I like to see in big budget AAA titles too. It's more plus points. You can throw your axe, and for the most part, it interacts with where it's going. Throw it into a wood or stone, and it lodges nicely in. Whilst creating a visible mark where it impacted the object. Really nice touches. Once again, though, it's just a shame that is mostly how it interacts with the environment, except for the obvious glowing interaction points which allow you to break things. Of course, where I grumbled before that these interactions are very limited, not allowing the player any thought process to think outside the box. I would have loved to have been able to cleave trees in half with a heavy attack, and then as it falls, catch it and swing it at enemies, which would have been an incredible use of the axe environment. I mean, Kratos demonstrates this. He can easily pick up trees in the intro. You also get awesome looking footprints in the mud, and snow that have great looking depth. To them, another nice touch, I'd like to see. But then other interactions that only half work or don't work at all. For example, during your first battle with a very early on with a troll, the environment is on fire for some reason, but you're seemingly immune to the to the flames. Although in combat, fire seems to be your worst enemy when used against you by enemies. And then, then there's me with my water interaction fetish. I was pleasantly surprised to see this wonderful effect of water dripping over Kratos. I absolutely love details like this. And I have mentioned it many times before. But then at the same, in the same instance, that the water next to the same stream does your usual non-existent interaction and just goes straight through Kratos. But hey, I'll forgive them a little, right? So I found God of War overall to be a good game, a very good game. There was never a point where I felt flat out hated it, and amongst all my gripes about the game, not really doing anything new gameplay wise, it's still a very, very solid title that is indeed worth playing. And whilst I wasn't engaged in the story nowhere near as much as I'd like to have been, it moves you along and it has some good moments. Even if some parts I had to take seriously. Is it the best God of War? I actually don't think so. I still prefer the original game, as well as even God of War 3 overall. I feel, even if this newer Kratos is far more bearable than the one who came into being in God of War 2 and 3. There are abundance of items and gear to find in the game, most of which you won't use when you reach a certain point. The incentive to try and get better gear greatly wanes because you've become so powerful anyway. There isn't really much stopping you, or you don't get much that adds anything different to or meaningful to the game. Now, this is another place where the Metroid similarities end, in my opinion. Samus gets new abilities that don't just open doors that were previously locked, but these new abilities allow for more movements, more skills in combat, and more evolution of the puzzles within the environments, as well as more environmental interaction in general, which evolves and heightens the games even more. This doesn't happen in God of War, save for one or two upgrades for Atreus, I felt. They stripped out quite a lot in this game, replaced it with other things, whilst completely leaving out others. They slowed the core game down, reduced the puzzles, reduced the number of large encounters, and instead went for a very story-driven title that has moments of greatness, but also overall left me wanting more, I feel. In my opinion, it's certainly not Game of the Generation, it's certainly not a revelation in video game storytelling, it's certainly not the best game to ever hit a Sony platform, I've heard some people say, but it's certainly a great title that should be played and is an exclusive that the PS4 should be proud of. So, now that I've clocked this game, if you're interested in a score for me, I'd probably give it an 8 out of 10. Not a bad score at all. A very similar score to how I would have scored the other God of War games. A title certainly worth playing. And let's hope that the sequels bring more.
I am.
What is it saying?